Good morning. So, I was having a discussion and the topic of panpsychism came up and we started getting into the moral philosophy of it. For those of you who don't know, panpsychism is the idea that consciousness is actually an innate property of matter. So it's distributed throughout the universe and everything is conscious. So you're conscious, I'm conscious, the sidewalk is conscious, the grass is conscious, the trees are conscious, the animals are conscious. Now, there are some interesting ethical implications here because one of the possibilities that's going on is actually, well, if everything is conscious, then it's possible that either a lot of things are wrong or a lot of things are kind of okay. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm a little bit less than agnostic on this position. I actually don't believe that it's correct. And the reason that I don't believe that panpsychism is possible or correct is because I've studied neuroscience. It was part of my education. And one of the problems with this is that it breaks Occam's razor, right? You're multiplying unnecessarily the potential explanations for things. We've seen in the universe, we see in other places that there are emergent properties, right? You know, if you arrange things just right, and pump some power into the right kind of molecules, you'll get a laser. Well, that only happens at a certain level of complexity, and it's really okay with me that there are things like consciousness that would happen, that would only happen under the right circumstances. And some people who entertain panpsychism think that this is somehow logically a problem. It's that, you know, we can't explain where consciousness comes from. Well, maybe it's just there all the time. It's like gravity or one of the other fundamental properties of the world. And as far as I can tell, this makes no sense because even human beings, even normal, you know, physiologically normal human beings regularly experience periods of complete unconsciousness. Now you might say that we're just not experiencing memory. You know, maybe we are conscious the entire time we're asleep or the whole time we're under anesthetic. We just don't remember anything. But this is almost analogous to the idea of the brain in a vat. This is an unfalsifiable hypothesis. If nobody can ever remember any of their unconscious states, then presumably we can't ever falsify this. And you could say, well, what if I figure out a way to make somebody remember their unconscious states? And people do sometimes claim that they're remembering anesthesia and things like that, and there are some real cases of people remembering anesthetic, but that's the whole thing. They actually are conscious for that. And when you're dreaming, you're actually conscious for that if you remember it. It's just an unusual state of consciousness. But neurologically, I don't think this is true because you need a central nervous system and nociceptors to feel pain. We're talking about the issue of suffering. But you definitely need a central nervous system to have experience as far as I can tell. I don't think plants have experience. I don't think rocks have experience. As a little follow-up to everything I just said, I am kind of willing to entertain the possibility that maybe sufficiently networked units of non-conscious things can produce the subjective experience of consciousness. So, for example, you have trees and mycelium networks. I don't think any individual tree is conscious. They don't have a complicated enough sort of nervous system-like structure. It's not even an issue of complexity. It's just the arrangement is not the same. But it is possible, maybe in some ways, that an entire forest full of trees that are connected with the mycelium network are maybe conscious. Again, I am at best agnostic on this one, but it is worth considering that may be the case. Maybe the internet has some form of something, maybe kind of, I don't really believe this, but it's a lot more plausible to me than the idea that just literally all matter is conscious, because all matter can do some vague form of information processing. It's not enough to just process information. You need a networked thing with a centralized structure and a periphery, as far as we can tell, right? Everything that passes any available muster for sentience has those features. It's not just a matter of having, you know, some interconnected, interlinked cells with, you know, some vague, you know, networking capacity or something like that. It's not just a network. It's a network with sort of a centralized body and a certain amount of specialization of function of different kinds of neural tissue and things like that. It's not just enough to have some signal conduction. But I thought I would throw that in there for those of you that are sort of on the fence. I don't even think that really rudimentary animals, such as jellyfish, for example, probably have any experience at all. They just have this simple neural ring. That's it. So that being said, let's pretend for the moment that we are entertaining the possibility that panpsychism is true. Well, one of the things about that is it means that you could be potentially causing harm to an infinite number of beings all the time. Now, this strikes me as, of course, a little bit morally ridiculous. This is very much along the lines of there are invisible specters behind you that disappear every time you look at them. You know, it's again, unfalsifiable hypothesis, and if something's unfalsifiable like that, I don't really entertain it. But one of the implications of panpsychism is that maybe everything is conscious, and then things that are more highly organized and better at information processing, like, for example, humans and animals, suffer more. And what we should be aiming for is to reduce the suffering that we cause, if we're trying to reduce the suffering as much as we can. And pretty much every moral philosophy, I think, does eventually get there. Any that are serious, unless you're some kind of hardcore, deontologist, and you just think certain things are right and certain things are wrong, and that's it. We are trying to reduce suffering. Even if you're religious, you're trying to, in a way, reduce the suffering caused to a deity, right? It's a higher form of consciousness, so you should be doing its will to keep it happy, in some ways. But one of the implications of panpsychism is that animals are conscious, they're a higher level of consciousness, and the matter that makes them up might be conscious in a separate way, potentially. So it's even more harm could be being caused than we previously think of when it comes to animals. So panpsychism, which is sometimes this idea that's bantered around, is completely compatible with the concept that we shouldn't be eating animals unnecessarily. And further, I guess we should be doing research to figure out how to make our food sources as simple as possible. Maybe we should be trying to, move past plants and keep it just bacterial or fungal or something like that. You might say, okay, well, fungi have mycelium networks, so maybe they can do some information processing, and if something can do a little bit of information processing, it's somehow more conscious. I don't think information processing is a perfect analogy to consciousness. I don't claim to understand exactly how consciousness arises, but as far as I can tell, it definitely has something to do with neural style networks. And yeah, just some thoughts about whether or not panpsychism and veganism are compatible. What other moral implications are there from panpsychism gets really interesting, because you could take the opposite tack and you could say, well, hang on, if everything is conscious, if I kill something, aren't I just dispersing that consciousness again? And then maybe you could still generate a morally coherent system that would be consistent with all the behaviors we normally think of as ethical, just by saying, okay, higher organizational states of consciousness matter more than not. So if I take, two identical beings, let's say human beings or animals, it doesn't really matter. But for whatever reason, one has a somewhat more disorganized form of consciousness and less memory and things like that, then we're good to go. I think the main difference between sort of a normal consciousness emerges from CNS kind of view and the panpsychist is that perhaps there are certain plants that we shouldn't be eating because they have sufficiently complicated minds that we're causing them suffering by doing so. Again, I don't really entertain this seriously. I don't think it's true. But even if you do consider yourself a panpsychist or some kind of animist or something, and you think that everything has some level of consciousness, another thing to consider is that consciousness does not equal a capacity for suffering then. As far as we can tell, nociceptors are the necessary ingredient for something to feel pain. And if somebody jumps in the comments and says something about, well, plants feel pain too, no. Plants conduct signals. There's actually no strong evidence that plants feel pain. There haven't been any studies that have been put out that plants feel pain. If you're reading what science journalists say about this topic as opposed to listening to the scientists themselves that study this stuff, or any reading the actual evidence itself, plants don't feel pain. They do conduct signals though, which is very interesting and impressive, and plant intelligence is certainly remarkable, but intelligence isn't exactly the same thing as consciousness. You can have consciousness with fairly low intelligence, and you can have relatively high intelligence with relatively low levels of consciousness. So that being said, if you are a panpsychist and you're listening to this, it still doesn't make sense to just run around eating animals unnecessarily, assuming that you are medically capable of doing so, which I think the majority of people are, as long as they get their nutrition right. And it's not even that hard. So yeah, just some thoughts on whether or not panpsychism has any moral implications. Hope you all are having a good day.